is that I see both of you springboarding off of. Michelle is springboarding it saying, hey, this is something we've observed and dialogued about in a lot of depth in a different field. So how interesting to see an economist go here, right? So I'm curious because I feel she's got some things to offer along those lines. Maybe there's some books and stuff that would be wise if we're going to start looking at this. I mean, I don't know, I don't want to use the word lean now, but if, you know, we're going to be looking at these small, local, relational buying, right? And selling. What sorts of books exist perhaps in the anthropological world might open this up better? Because, I mean, this man is interesting. He definitely is playing with words and ideas differently than a lot of authors I've read. And I get why the people who read him were intrigued with his I don't know, maybe novel way that he is going about talking about things. I mean, he literally starts off by talking about logical fallacies. Oh, hope you know what they are. Oh, but by the way, there is no way of talking and having an argument where there aren't logical fallacies. But we should observe if they're just grossly out of control. So it's a very interesting little thing. It's exactly where he starts you. You know, I've heard of people really talk about logical fallacies before and why they're valuable to know, but then never have the conversation about how that works out in actual arguments, right? That the fact that every argument to an extent, we're leaning on a series of crutches. So anyway, like I said, the guy is a little bit different. And I think it'll be worth it to maybe pick certain sections in here and read them together. But what I'm intrigued with is it's springboarding at least both Paul and Michelle into thinking about resources that perhaps are dialoguing on local, personally responsible types of economies and how to grow them. Like I was thinking about the book, and I know, Paul, you gave it a look, and I don't know where I have it right now, but it was The Village Towns. And in this book, they are all about this. They have, I believe, they are financed to build 2 of them. I think they wanted to do one in Mendocino and one in New Zealand. But I'm like, do it. Like, you know what I mean? Let's rewind this bizarre atomic suburban sprawl that, you know what I mean? That we can't know one another. You know what I mean? We're just locked in our little, I mean, sometimes I wonder how much square feet I actually live in. Do you know what I'm saying? Like if my home were a prison cell, which I guess maybe that analogy is cropping up now, partly because of what this year has been like. Right. But anyway, so I would be curious, Paul, if you are familiar with books where somebody did a good job with that, talking about building in a very intentional and focused way, like layer upon layer within one area. How do we keep bringing this back to the local and building those relationships and moving back into trust and moving away from this, the monoculture? And Michelle, what books would you think that anthropologists offered that have done a better job talking about the roots of all of this?
Well, I can speak a little bit to the first question, and recognizing that, again, during the time that he was writing this, so he was writing this in kind of the mid-aughts, I think. He died in 2010 or 2011 with it unfinished. And then this got put together and published in 2016. So as he was developing these ideas, he was working very closely with Rob Hopkins and other people who then went on to create the transition town movement, which was really focused on localization. And in particular, this was a time when peak oil was a major concern for people. There were a lot of people who thought that we would get to peak oil before climate change became a real problem. So they were really looking at how do we run communities that don't rely on fossil fuels, and in particular don't rely on all of the artificial discounts of transportation costs that are associated with fossil fuels, so that everything that could be produced locally would be produced locally, and be fairly self-contained. You know, going back to a time essentially when shipping costs would be the same as they were during the age of sail, which is to say the risks are very high. You only bother to ship things that are lightweight and compact relative to their value. You certainly don't ship tons and tons of plastic crap. And you certainly don't ship fresh vegetables. You don't even ship grain, though you might ship alcohol because that's a condensed high value thing that's worth shipping. Otherwise, it's just sort of like spices and silks and really localized, hard to produce elsewhere items. So there's several books that were published in the around 2010 about the transition town movement. When it comes to this economic question, there's a giant book that I'm still hoping someday I will have time to read, but I'm halfway through it, called Debt by David Graeber. That is utterly brilliant and really worth reading. And I'm honestly, everything that David Graeber ever wrote is worth reading. And I would love to get us onto this little chat book that he published called Toward an Anarchist Anthropology. Great stuff. But yeah, my kind of nerd. What intrigued me about this book was the simple fact that he is trying to do something fairly total and interdisciplinary. Not necessarily succeeding, but making a solid attempt in a way that I have not seen in other books. So it to me feels like a really good launching point for all of the conversations about how all of the various moving pieces and parts in that kind of cultural transformation might be considered.
Hey, Leoma, I was just sort of priming Michelle and Paul to talk about books that they feel perhaps did a better job with what this one is pointing at. There's some key things this book is trying to address, and that maybe there are already people doing it better, or you know what I mean, or at least areas of it where there are better, more clear answers or dialogue. So thank you. So the book that we were just talking about was Debt by David Graeber. Garber, how do you say his name?
Graeber.
Graeber, thank you, Graeber.
Yeah. Debt, the first 5,000 years.
And then,
yeah, you can find a lot of his lectures on YouTube.
Oh, good. And then maybe Toward an Anarchist Anthropology was one you're intrigued with, Michelle.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what was that Graeber name again? It's
Graeber, I think. Here, let me go get the book. He also wrote a really fun book called, which is relevant to this one as well, called Bullshit Jobs, a Theory.
Such a great book.
Yes.
Oh my God.
But this is a monster. It's so rich and so detailed, and oh my God, the footnotes are so brilliant.
Graeber?
Graeber.
And you say he's got some YouTube stuff.
Yeah, yeah, you can find a lot of, he can find a lot of the talks that he was giving, promoting this book, and actually a lot promoting this book, because this was more recent, that are on YouTube. And he passed away last year, possibly of COVID. I haven't looked that up, but it was about 2 months into the pandemic, and he was in Europe, and he had seemed okay, and then he sounded like he had a respiratory disease in his last couple of videos, and then he was gone.
Yeah.
So, you know, it could have been lung cancer, it could have been any number of other things. I haven't looked into it, but yeah.
Well, thank you for resources. So as far as this book today, we talked about figuring out what lean means. I'm just looking back at that chat again. Talking about how he is taking simple concepts like growth, continuity, descent, collapse, or the 7-point protocol, and kind of doing a different kind of approach. I don't know if we want to get in more. I had talked a little bit about the little quick, you know, remake of Crying Wolf he gave, right? You know, so we have your original story of Boy Crying Wolf, but now we have this very clear other, he had this fixed, corrected fable for us about what's really happening in these times. And then let's see. So I guess then we kind of got a little bit into lean economy basics, which is sort of what we have been doing.
Yeah, which, you know, is the same as the 7-point protocol, essentially.
We had a bit of discussion about the fallacies thing. I don't know if there's really much to go there aside from he just wanted us to be alert to it in this talk. We spent some time last week on descent and climate trajectories, and I think my favorite thing was what Paul said, and that I keep having to remember, and I haven't, it's been just on the tip of my tongue a couple times when I'm talking to people when they're scared of the drop off. You know what I mean? Instead of flipping that over and saying, this means life, the biosphere takes off. You know what I mean? And so I can't have a, fad plastic object. You know what I'm saying? You know, I mean, I just think about how many of these are floating around in the world? You know what I mean? These little plasticky, I mean, so I can't have that.
Right.
There'll be this, but there'll be life. And we even talked, and then I thought you did a great job with that, Paul, and talking about those 3 types of maybe true wealth that often aren't counted as wealth. So,
Yeah. And let's just, that reminds me, yeah, since we weren't recording that, I just want to actually articulate those.
Yeah.
So and check on if what I jotted down was, so the 3 primary places to look for wealth, as you said it, Paul, was one, what source of wealth? One
Right.
example of wealth
So
is the abundance and variety of life.
Yeah, the abundance and variety of life on Earth. And then the uniqueness of every human being. You know, I think Hannah Arendt says, with every human being is unique, so that with every birth, a unique essence comes into the world, a someone where no one was before. And then when you sort of combine those two, the infinite possibilities of our being in the world together, and I use the word our inclusively to include the greater than human. But even if you just mean the human, it's very clear that those things are on the wane, that we have mass extinction, depleting, the variety of life is being depleted. The abundance of life is being depleted. 68% of the mammals are gone. The uniqueness of every human being now really has nowhere to manifest. No time, no when would even be better. no time, no energy, no attention, no community because of all of those things being so scarce. That's really why UBI is so important, because right away we free up time. Right away, the arbitrary, I will go do something that degrades my humanity and the biosphere both severely because I can't eat otherwise, is not good. But yeah, those are the three, I think, that wealth is really an experience much more than an object, almost more a verb than a noun, but certainly more an experience.
Yeah.
And that experience in a capitalist society where you have to earn your living, right? It's like your arrival in the world is seen as a deficit that you have to compensate for by proving useful. It's not enough that you're here. No one's going to tell you, oh, how great that you're here. My existence is richer because of you. None of us live in communities where that's a routine event. It should be, right? That's what Bob's Cafe was like, was that people all the time were having the experience, oh, how great it is that you're here. Because it was just a really unlikely mix of people. You would never have met those people. In the sort of default system, Bob created a little universe where people who were otherwise segregated could meet. But that experience of gladness to be alive and gladness that you're alive, and gladness that life is so abundant and varied and beautiful and stunning. That, right, we could all be having that experience all the time. There's not like a material obstacle to that. What there is a system that drags us emphatically away from that experience. And then wealth, when we use that word now, it's almost obscene. Because what we mostly mean is control, just like power. What we mostly mean by power is control, and what we mostly mean by wealth is control, because after you have a certain amount of money, right, you can't spend it. All you can do with it is use it to control how the mortal hours of human beings, the life of the greater than human world, and what we call resources in it, are deployed. That's what you can do with that money. There's nothing else to do with it.
So thank you for clarifying
Sorry.
for anybody who couldn't be here. Okay, so we kind of talked about these things, and the next thing on the list is, and I remember how it came up, they were talking about language, and particularly perhaps the English language with its narrative and the ways that it helps and hinders. I had some other thoughts about language, but I don't know that it's something that came out of this book. So I don't want to lead us down too far, but I think that there's this historic mistake that's being made about causation, where we find it very appealing to be able to just narrow things down and find one, oh, here's the one problem. Oh, and then we could just apply this little Band-Aid, done, right? And it's a vast oversimplification of what's really going on. And that one simple fix is in our own selves, is to teach the pause. You know what I mean? To notice that hunger, to come up with a simple solution, a finger to point, you know what I mean? And then we get to be done. And not only that, but even the Band-Aid on it, you know what I mean? Thinking that got the problem without going back and checking if it got the problem, right? So that hunger is in each of us, and that one of the first things we can do is take that extra pause, to recognize there's probably complexities here that need a minute to be understood, and then to teach that to others, to do it in ourselves and to do it for others. And that way, without getting into perhaps the intricacies of what the entire historic context of English and all of its potentials and perhaps blank spots, but by giving something our complete attention and pausing, that we can perhaps bump ourselves out of this almost addictive oversimplification. So I don't know if that's where we were wanting to go, or if you guys want to spend more time talking about language, but that was the next little bullet on our list.
Well, I think, the other thing, and we sort of started with the problem of lean as part of the language specifically that Fleming is using. And that is, part of what we're left to work with here is whether there are better ways to articulate the key points that are of really high value in this book. I did want to pop back to respond to a couple of things that Paul had said. That I guess the Hannah Arendt-based notion of the uniqueness of every human and every human arrival as a cause for celebration. Well, that's, again, something that we actually see in lots of non-empire cultures, but actually this is where Graeber is really excellent, is articulating how one of the important shifts into cultures of money and debt are the reversal of that you owe your life, your life is a debt owed to the gods. You owe your life to the person who spared your life, and therefore it is legitimate for that person to make you a slave. And that's where a lot of the source of debt comes from. We typically only see debt showing up as a sort of a sequel or amelioration of a slavery system. So, being a debt slave is a real thing. But a lot of it is on this valuation of human life as somehow something that is and can be owed to others, and that therefore is a burdensome debt to be repaid somehow.
Do you see a way to translate lean? What he means, so that it's no longer that? Because if we could translate it, if there's something really good there that I'm not necessarily valuing correctly, in this country politically, that word is just, it's fatal. And it's fatal because wages have been plummeting in relation to the cost of housing and healthcare and college tuition, and then that list gets longer as you go along. But that's been going on for decades. So the experience of people in this country is that life is already way too lean. Is that being, like I'm in this, I could just barely, with all of my waking hours, manage the things you need before you can start living. Is how people feel, starved of being valued, starved of having time to spend with their children. It feels very lean.
Thriving is a very overused word at the moment, but I think, health, abundance, and thriving is what I hear him describing. He's describing something that's abundant, and he's describing something that, right? It's almost like flipping the chart. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? We're going to be making a lot less, little tiny objects and shipping them everywhere, right? But we're going to have a lot more of all this other stuff, abundance and variety of the biosphere. space for human beings to be unique and enjoy that, and many more ways of interacting instead of perhaps these little narrow bands that we're interacting within.
So, Leoma?
I'd like to go back to what you were saying, Michelle, about the debt. So that the debt entering with war and slavery and conquering. You're saying that historically, anthropologically, it seems that that's where it really gets started.
In a way. So, yeah, when you start to talk about monetary debt, absolutely, that's very closely tied in. But there are sort of systems of slavery that one could say even precede monetary systems, or at least exist outside of monetary systems, that are about warfare and the threat of death to someone, and then that person owes you their life because you chose not to kill them and instead just to keep them.
Right.
So I will let you live and you will serve me.
Exactly.
And
And usually, until the U.S. slavery system in particular, as sort of the pre-colonial and then pre-revolutionary and then through the Civil War U.S. system of slavery, was exceptional in that was a permanent condition and it applied to your offspring, which was not the case in most other systems of slavery. You owe me your life, for the next 10 or 15 years.
but you could get what about in
Get
Rome?
out.
In Rome, in Greece, were people born slaves? And
In Greece,
Not many.
Greece is such a problem because it's where we get our idea of democracy. And it was totally built on the backs of slaves. And, those Athenians that we admire so much, they were vocal about how the only way to be free in the public square was to be a tyrant in the household and to have nothing, right? Life on earth, according to the Greeks, is like just an experience of a crushing burden of necessity. And all the specifically human qualities are just throttled by it. So you have to get other people to be like in between you and the earth, because otherwise the earth will devour everything that's human about you. That's really how they saw it. In Greece, the slaves were not ever regarded as inferior. They were unlucky because slaves were defeated in combat. And then what happens is your victor has a literal sword at your throat and you're given a choice. I can kill you now, or you can continue to live, but who you are is not going to matter anymore. You'll live just so who I am can thrive in the world. You will be in the darkness of the household, attending to things that belong in the darkness, like life. Women were very low on the status because of life. They were connected to life. They gave birth. Reproduction was just part of the chain of woe, the great curse that the Greeks somehow turned the miracle of life on earth into. So it's not very different than today. Think of that sword at the throat, and then think of the condition that people are in most of the time. How much of their activity is voluntary, right? We have things that are voluntary. We choose partners. We choose to have children. We try to give them attention. We may befriend neighbors. There are things like that. But how much of our lives ever get to anything where the word voluntary has a meaning? Really, almost none. So it's that sword at the throat. It's knowing all the time that you're in a society that is quite willing, as we have seen so dramatically in this pandemic, quite willing to throw you and your kids on the street, to starve you, to subject you to any form of deprivation, however cruel, unless you make yourself useful. And it gets harder and harder and harder to be useful enough.
So, Leoma, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to finish the inquiry a little bit more with, so before this started, Michelle, you seemed to indicate that the valuing of individual life was more.
That's what we see in most, the old growth societies, is that individuals are highly valued. Well, individuals within your group are highly valued.
What about women and men? Is there tend to be a...
In most food foraging societies, it tends to be very equal in terms of, there tend to be very clear divisions of labor, that men do certain things and women do certain things. A lot of that has to do with, sort of differences in strength and running endurance. So tasks like hunting favor men, and things that are compatible with childcare. So tasks where you don't have to move very fast because you've got toddlers with you are usually done by women. But the valuation of those, it's not like men are uniformly considered superior. That is not a pattern that you ever see in a foraging, because they need each other desperately. Men, with very few exceptions, mostly in the high Arctic, hunting is so unreliable that they don't actually bring in nearly as many calories as women. So while when they do bring stuff in, it's a cause for a big celebration and it's a big prestige bonus for the man, everybody knows that it's the women that are making it possible so everyone can eat.
Now you're talking about foraging. So does this extend into farming societies?
Intensive farming with irrigation, no. Horticultural societies, generally, yes, which is, again, much more what you see when you think of small scale villages, is their mixed horticulture foraging.
Like the Iroquois.
Yeah. Well, and the Americas are complicated because we didn't really have access to large, heavy, domesticatable animals. So
that prevented the intensive agriculture in the same way.
Yeah. So it took a lot, and the high productivity of corn made it possible more in Mesoamerica than farther north. But
because I get curious about how, because it doesn't seem to me like a done deal. It's inevitably going to happen that you get this kind of valuing of the individual just because you change the debt system. It seems to me like you have to find a way to build a social transition into valuing.
But really, people do value individuals. Think about how different people are when they're in college. People I know really love undergraduate education, in part, not so much because it's devoted to learning, that's very cool, but because there's all this leisure. I mean, you have to study, but your relations with the people around you are not determined very much. And you're there for something that at least has a distinct human purpose, the gaining of knowledge and understanding. It's wonderful. And the value of individuals in college, I think, is so much greater. And then you get in the workplace, and everything about the workplace says your individuality doesn't matter at all, right? You don't even want it to be visible. You're afraid of letting it show. So I don't think it's that hard. And I think what the Iroquois had that allowed them, when they were deciding tribal affairs, to listen to every member of the tribe and to listen without interruption, you know, that's the thing that made Ben Franklin do his giant double take about, oh, well, that's just like objectively more civilized and so much closer to what we say we're trying to create. That's freedom. Everyone gets heard. Nothing's decided until everyone has been heard. I think that comes out of, in part, the experience of cooperating to feed yourselves. That when you're cooperating to meet your material needs, there's a tendency for that to acquire an almost like a dance-like quality, because that also stunned people when they came here, the British colonists. The apparent ease and pleasure with which indigenous people went about meeting their material needs, that it wasn't dirge-like, it wasn't awful. You have to remember, what were the colonists experiencing? In Virginia, our first colony, they were dying in the tens of thousands as indentured servants who were made to work when they were ill. They didn't get any time off, not paid at all, just kept alive, but then worked to death. And a guy from Holland who wrote about this, a traveler, said, you just can't believe it. They're going through them so fast. It's like they can't keep their stock of indentured servants full enough to keep going. That has never gone away, and that's pure violence, right? There's nothing but violence anymore. And just every time I read about the pandemic, I think of the indentured servants. There were only 500 slaves in Virginia for a long time, relatively speaking. I mean, after slavery's invented, for decades, there are tens of thousands of white people being worked to death. And a horrible thing being born. But I guess I'm trying to say this experience of your life not mattering, of you needing to plow through this horrible, just torment existence, this existence of constant punishment in order to earn your right to eat. That experience is so traumatic. It's very deep in us. And it makes it very easy for us to take like 2 steps towards freedom and then 12 steps back, because that fear is so intense. My professor Shar used to say, it's not just conquest, it's conquest over and over and over and over again, right? Because at first, when there's conquest, all the qualities in us that you see in indigenous, I don't know a single indigenous people where there's individual poverty, by the way, none. But the qualities you see, that tend to add up to gladness to be alive and a whole lot more time for living than we have, those qualities try to reassert themselves after conquest, right? Life tries to become human again. And so it's the fact that this crazy way of living is unsustainable and is constantly has to go looking for people to take by force into its, to dominate so that it can continue to exist, because all the wealth is concentrated. It's completely unnatural and top heavy and prone to collapse. But it's those repeated invasions, those repeated experiences of being conquering. It's like the resilience of the human spirit gets not exhausted, but spread thin. So it's resilient in some people, but there are a lot of people who are just sort of beaten. No, life is not going to be human.
So yeah, these are hard things you're talking about, Paul, and it's a little overwhelming in these times just to focus too much on that. But I do think this book is meant to be hopeful. I'm not saying it has answers for us, but I think part of the reason the man has the approach that he's doing is he is trying to show us, like, remember he talked about these four basic ideas around economy. You have an economy that's growing, or maybe an economy that's continuous, or you have an economy that's in descent, or you have an economy that's going to collapse. And what sort of choices do we have? So we begin to look at more and more turbulence happening in all of these various areas, right? Like, because we did all of this interruption and with the local, but no, now, we're thinking, oh, well, what can stabilize? Bring it back to the local, right? So we're looking at these 7 points. And when he uses this word lean, he's trying to take us into thinking about big economy, which we don't think about very well anyway, but whatever, big economy turning over because we're good consumers, right? Buying the latest products and services to a kind of economy that is smaller. So I think by lean, he was trying to imply smaller, but we agree that there is, coming out of perhaps the history you're describing, Paul, a psychological problem with selling this to folks. You know what I'm saying? If they think life is going to be even harder than what they're already experiencing. So instead, what he's doing is he's showing the problems with no local intervention and the benefits of lots of local intervention. The problems with all products being standardized versus the benefits of product diversity. And he felt lean helped people go from standardized products, unlean, right, to lean, product diversity, everything a little bit unique, just made perhaps for the moment, you know what I mean? Not this mass thing. So we were looking at trying to find a word perhaps that we could use that's not lean, because people are feeling a bit pressured right now, and we don't want to, in helping them envision something new, we don't want them to feel like, okay, time, gotta get the next doctorate, just gotta get through this, okay, there's just another marathon here, so we don't want to live that in this moment either. So at this moment, we can listen to one another and pause. And so I think one of the things we're dancing around is this book. What he's trying to do is present something and show the appeal of this change. This is a change that needs to happen and can happen and has wonderful survivability and abundance, but people need to begin to see how you go from a large number of sellers and buyers to a smaller local number of sellers and buyers who have a lot of influence, which can sound really scary to local people maybe, because at this point, all those influences are kind of steps away from us. And then it's only scary when they've polluted your water, right? That gets scary. But, but otherwise, you won't want to make the person mad who has the only rice in your area, right? So you begin to value the relationship. And that might sound scary because we've been throwing the relationships to the wind. As a matter of fact, it was one of the things I got out of Hannah Arendt. I don't know my neighbors. We were doing these different things. We were getting together. What can we do about this environmental change? Well, things might happen thick and fast, and you're going to be dealing with the people immediately around you. Who's around me? Oh my gosh, when do I ever sit with my neighbors? So like, let's see, they talk about having free entry and exit versus perhaps barriers to entry. And I think about how incredibly unpopular, among some folks in America, this barrier to entry across Mexico and the United States were. But they're talking about that on a much smaller level. They're not trying to talk about what America federal policy is. They're talking about on a local level. But being able to move freely has also been, I know my family had to come to California. They could no longer prosper in Oklahoma and Arkansas. And you know what I mean? So I have these roots of like mixed poor people who weren't thriving and, and bootstrap, somehow got here, right? So they talk about profit maximization versus perhaps having multiple aims, or imperfect knowledge versus perfect knowledge, right? So having and I find this really interesting to think about virtue and ignorance. So I'm saying, so he's trying to present something, and he uses this term carnival, which I find really an interesting choice because there's something a little vulgar about carnival. There's something a little, that not far back, you could, come see the bearded woman. You know what I'm saying? Carnival evokes odd images in me, and that he's choosing it and then talking about going from perfect knowledge to perhaps this rural, local, imperfect knowledge. Anyway, and he's trying to package and sell it. That's what I see in this book, that and it's not just that, he's trying to get people to run to it and embrace it to save life. So anyway, that's what he was trying to do when he said lean, because he was trying to get people to think about going from something big, right?
Well, big, and he talks about the burden of all of these intermediate products and processes that become necessary when things are scaled that large. And so a lot of it is, just as in the sort of management theory of getting rid of the middle management, it's getting rid of all that intervening stuff. When we have economies of scale, we have all of this incredible infrastructure around shipping. I lived in Singapore. You should see the port there. It's nuts. It's this monster of ruined coastline. You look out on the water, and it's like you could hop from boat to boat for miles. That's an incredible investment in infrastructure that shouldn't be necessary at all. And that's true not only of like physical infrastructure like ports and highways and a lot of that, and then of course the vehicles that go from place to place and all of the people employed in all of that. But then there's the economic infrastructure. We have all these layers and layers of lenders and insurers and all of this stuff that proliferates bullshit jobs, right? That wouldn't be necessary. So he's saying lean economy of get rid of all the stuff that doesn't actually contribute to quality of life. And you'll have people who actually have more and are also happier. But again, there's this question of the the language and the way to market it, I don't think he had gotten to a point of really refining that in a way. And there are some real problems with calling it lean because people hear that and think austerity. They think tightening the belt. And that's, you know, he very much makes the case later that when you have well-functioning local economies, usually the problem is they're too productive. And you actually have to find way, and Carnival is in part a way to make people take, you know, everyone must take time away because it's Carnival time. So you can't go out and work. And everyone must use up the abundance and spread it around. And that's, you see potlatch and similar traditions like that, again, all over the place, where you have naturally productive, abundant ways of making a living. They're producing too much. And most cultures realize you can't let that stuff accumulate because it's toxic. So you have to find ways to get it redistributed, or simply, you know, in the Pacific Northwest, because of the salmon runs, it was so extreme that they actually said, let's just show off and burn things. It gets you social prestige, but it gets rid of that source of inequality. There's a culture, I was trying to look this up earlier, there's a culture, I know it's somewhere in what we would now call Latin America, and this is more recent, this is post-colonial, where the mayor would always be whoever's the richest. But their job as mayor was that they had to throw the big annual festival. And by the end of the year, their year as mayor, they had social prestige for the bigger and better party they threw, but they were flat broke again. So nobody stayed rich too long and nobody stayed poor, because that big party, everybody got stuff. It got redistributed. It was a way to deal with it. And everybody kind of knew, you know, when it was going to be their turn, because they could see, oh, I'm starting to get richer than all my neighbors. Oh my God, they're going to make me mayor and I'm going to have to give it all away. But it was worth it because prestige.
This would be a great book. Absolutely wonderful. If you were a professor of economics, trying to explain to your students why they shouldn't drink the Kool-Aid, why the thing that was being presented to them as normal wasn't, because everything he's talking about, like it's right sort of there in Adam Smith. There is a whole set of assumptions that really require things to be local. You know, it also really requires people to be living in a state of much greater equality and much less insecurity, because otherwise you can't ever discover what talent you have, what you might be able to create that would enhance life for you and the people around you. So, you know, the things people like are all ideas in market theory. It's an appealing idea that no one has to tell us how we're related to each other, you know, that we can somehow just stumble onto it, each pursuing what seems good to us. That's a very appealing idea. And you can create conditions where that's true in a certain limited way. My alternative to lean is to draw a circle that's like the city state. This is a city, that's the unit of political thought. Everything gets messed up when you get larger. But in a city state, right, in Athens, the model for all modern democracies, a city state, there is a marketplace. It is not the city state. It's this bounded area, and you go there and then you go out, right? And then there's a public space that is infinitely more important to those who get to be in it, that is about deciding things of real importance to the entire community, to all of Athens. But the market is this little bounded thing. And the Greeks, in the same way they did not like necessity, or viewed nature as like this big crushing burden of necessity, they didn't like the market. They wanted it tightly bound, so that there could be a space for freedom.
I've had a long day. Thank you, you guys. I'm gonna have to bow out, but I
Yeah.
just wanted
We're
to
actually over
say
time.
Adam Smith was you're talking about the wealth of nations. So maybe some people are familiar with that, but I needed the dots connected about who Adam Smith was. But thank you so much, you guys. This is really, really good. And I'm getting a lot out of talking this all through, because that's the purpose of what we're reading. The man is giving a lot of details, but I guess for me, it's nice to hear where it's going and its purposes, and how it could maybe even be more clear.
Yeah.
I'll see you all
Thank you all.
soon.
We've got to go too.
Yeah. Okay.
My apologies.
All right. See y'all soon.
Bye-bye and love.